Oscar Smith was a 73-year-old inmate in Tennessee. He had spent over 3 decades on the state's death row. Smith was executed for the 1989 murders of his estranged wife and her 2 sons. The victims were identified as 35-year-old Judith Smith, 16-year-old Chad Burnett, and 13-year-old Jason Burnett. The brutal murders occurred in their Nashville home. Smith was subsequently sentenced to death in 1990 for the crimes. Prosecutors at the time argued that Smith was motivated by anger over the couple's pending divorce. Evidence presented during the trial included a bloody palm print found at the scene of the crime. This print was a key piece of evidence linking Smith to the murders. Despite this, Smith would spend the next 32 years appealing his conviction and sentence. His case became a focal point for discussions about the finality of capital punishment. It also raised questions about the evidence used to secure a death sentence. The long duration of his time on death row highlighted the lengthy and complex nature of the appeals process in capital cases. It underscored the decades that can pass between conviction and execution. Smith's case began in the late 1980s, a different era for forensic science and legal standards. His execution in the 2020s brought the case into a modern context. Oscar Smith's execution was the first carried out in Tennessee since 2020. This marked a significant event after a period of inactivity. The execution took place at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville. This facility houses the state's death row inmates and execution chamber. The method of execution used was lethal injection. This is the primary method employed by Tennessee and many other states. Smith was pronounced dead at 10:47 a.m. The process followed a specific protocol designed by the state. His execution had been subject to a series of delays. These delays stemmed from various legal challenges and procedural issues. The path to the execution chamber was not direct or swift. It involved multiple court filings and interventions. These delays are not uncommon in death penalty cases. They reflect the intense legal scrutiny and challenges that typically precede an execution. The pause in execution since 2020 added another layer of significance to Smith's case. It meant his execution would be the first test of the state's readiness and protocols after a hiatus. Smith's execution was initially scheduled for 2022. However, it did not proceed as planned on that date. Governor Bill Lee granted a temporary reprieve in 2022. This decision paused Smith's execution just hours before it was set to occur. A reprieve was granted due to significant concerns over the state's lethal injection protocols. Issues had been identified that cast doubt on the reliability of the process. An internal review conducted by the state revealed failures in testing the chemicals used for lethal injections. This failure raised serious questions about the integrity of the drugs. This discovery led Governor Lee to suspend all executions in Tennessee. The suspension was ordered to allow for a thorough investigation and review. An independent investigation was subsequently conducted. This investigation aimed to identify the root causes of the protocol failures and recommend corrective actions. The investigation resulted in the implementation of protocol reforms. These revised procedures were put in place in December of the previous year. Smith's execution was the first to be carried out under these newly revised procedures. It served as the initial test of the updated protocol's effectiveness and legality. The issues uncovered highlighted potential systemic problems within the state's execution process. They raised concerns about oversight and quality control. A need for an independent investigation underscored the seriousness of the identified failures. It suggested a lack of confidence in the state's ability to police itself on this critical matter. The reforms were intended to address the specific testing failures. However, they did not necessarily alleviate all concerns about the lethal injection process itself. The focus on chemical testing pointed to the complex and often opaque nature of obtaining and verifying the drugs used in executions. This remains a challenge for many states. Smith's case became inextricably linked to these protocol issues. His execution date was directly impacted by the state's need to address these failures. The successful completion of his execution, from the state's perspective, marked the end of the execution suspension. It signaled a return to carrying out death sentences in Tennessee. However, the underlying questions about the reliability and transparency of the process did not entirely disappear. They continued to be raised by legal advocates and critics. The state asserted that the new protocols were sound. Critics remained skeptical, pointing to the history of errors and the continued secrecy surrounding the process. Oscar Smith consistently maintained his innocence throughout his decades on death row. He long disputed the validity of his conviction for the 1989 murders. Smith's legal team mounted numerous challenges to his conviction. They cited what they argued was new evidence that warranted a re-examination of the case. Specifically, they pointed to advancements in fingerprint technology and DNA testing. They contended that these modern forensic techniques could shed new light on the evidence. His team claimed that this new evidence excluded him as the killer. They argued that the original conviction was based on flawed or incomplete analysis. They specifically mentioned a fingerprint found on a murder weapon at the scene. They asserted that this print did not belong to Smith or any of the victims. This unidentified print, they argued, suggested the presence of another individual involved in the crime. This directly contradicted the state's case against Smith as the sole perpetrator. Despite these arguments and the presentation of potential new evidence, courts consistently denied his appeals. State and federal courts upheld the original conviction. The legal system found the new evidence insufficient to overturn the original jury's verdict. The standard for introducing new evidence after conviction is often very high. Tennessee's Supreme Court recently declined to hear another appeal from Smith. This decision effectively exhausted his state-level judicial remedies. Following the court's denial, Smith's last hope rested with the governor. His legal team petitioned Governor Lee to grant clemency. Governor Lee ultimately declined to grant clemency. This decision cleared the way for the execution to proceed after the protocol issues were addressed. The denial of clemency meant that the state would move forward with the death sentence. It signaled the end of the legal road for Oscar Smith. His case highlights the challenges faced by inmates seeking to introduce new evidence decades after a conviction. The legal system is often resistant to reopening old cases. The debate over the significance of the unidentified fingerprint persisted among his supporters and legal team. They saw it as compelling evidence of potential innocence. The state, however, maintained confidence in the original conviction. They argued that the evidence presented at trial was sufficient to prove Smith's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The final legal decisions underscored the difficulty of overcoming a death sentence once it has been imposed. The system is designed with multiple layers of review, but ultimately, those reviews can be exhausted. As the time for his execution approached, Oscar Smith was given the opportunity to make a final statement. He spoke for approximately 3 minutes. In his final words, delivered from the execution gurney, he insisted he was innocent. This was a position he had maintained for over 3 decades. He used his last moments to criticize the justice system. He expressed profound dissatisfaction with how his case and others like it are handled. He also directed criticism towards Governor Lee. Smith believed the governor had the power to intervene and prevent his execution. Smith stated clearly, "Our justice system is broken." This was a central theme of his final message. He specifically said that Governor Lee has the power to stop this. He appealed directly to the governor's authority to grant clemency. Smith claimed that too many innocent people are being killed by the state. He suggested his case was not an isolated incident. He looked towards the witnesses and stated, "We have more men waiting to die at Riverbend." He referenced the other inmates on Tennessee's death row. He continued, "I won't be the first and I won't be the last." This suggested a belief that the system would continue to execute potentially innocent individuals. Moments before the lethal drugs were administered, he spoke to his spiritual advisor. He reiterated his claim of innocence, stating, "I didn't kill her." For his last meal, Smith requested hot dogs, tater tots, and apple pie with vanilla ice cream. This detail provided a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. His final statement was a powerful and direct indictment of the system that was about to end his life. It was a final plea and protest. The content of his statement resonated with death penalty opponents and those critical of the justice system. It reinforced their arguments about the risks of executing innocent people. His specific mention of the reference to other men on death row served as a reminder that Smith's case was part of a larger system. It pointed to the ongoing nature of capital punishment in the state. His quiet assertion to his spiritual advisor, "I didn't kill her," was a final, personal declaration of innocence. It was a moment of private conviction in a very public setting. The choice of a simple last meal provided a brief, humanizing detail. It offered a glimpse into the final, mundane choices made in extraordinary circumstances. Attorney Kelly Henry represented Oscar Smith in his final appeals. She voiced significant concerns regarding the execution process. Henry expressed concerns about Tennessee's history of mistakes in administering executions. She pointed to past issues that raised doubts about the state's competence. She questioned the effectiveness and constitutionality of the new protocol implemented by the state. She argued that the revised procedures were still flawed. Henry stated that the new protocol fails to address fundamental problems of the prior one. She believed the core issues remained unresolved. She highlighted the secrecy surrounding the lethal injection chemicals used by the state. This lack of transparency, she argued, was problematic. Henry suspected the drugs were acquired from the gray market. This term refers to sources outside the typical pharmaceutical supply chain, increasing risk. Acquiring drugs from such sources, she argued, increases the risk of compromised quality or unknown composition. This could lead to complications during the execution. She raised serious concerns about the potential for a tortuous death under the new protocol. She feared the inmate could experience extreme suffering. Henry stated that the execution method, using pentobarbital, causes excruciating pain and suffering. She based this assertion on findings from autopsies of executed inmates. These autopsies, she claimed, showed evidence consistent with pulmonary edema, a condition causing a sensation of drowning or burning. This suggested the drug was not causing a peaceful death. She argued forcefully that the state should not keep information about the chemical secret. This information, she contended, should be available to prisoners and the public. The secrecy prevents proper scrutiny and verification of the drugs being used. It hinders the ability to assess the risk of a botched execution. Henry's perspective underscored the ongoing legal and ethical challenges surrounding lethal injection. It highlighted the difficulties states face in obtaining drugs and ensuring a humane process. Her arguments about the gray market and potential for pain resonated with critics of capital punishment. They reinforced concerns about the humaneness of the death penalty. The legal challenges brought by Henry and her team sought to prevent the execution based on these protocol concerns. They argued that the method violated the constitutional prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. While the courts ultimately allowed the execution to proceed, Henry's concerns remained. They contributed to the broader debate about the death penalty in Tennessee and beyond. Her advocacy highlighted the role of defense attorneys in challenging not just guilt, but also the method and legality of the punishment itself. It showed the lengths to which legal teams go to protect their clients' rights, even in the face of execution. Oscar Smith's execution reignited debates surrounding the death penalty in Tennessee and across the nation. His case brought the controversial practice back into public focus. It also reignited debates about the reliability of forensic evidence used in past convictions. The questions raised about the fingerprint highlighted potential flaws in older cases. His case gained national attention partly due to the protocol issues and his persistent claims of innocence. It became a symbol for various aspects of the death penalty debate. Smith's execution serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing debate surrounding capital punishment. The fundamental questions about its morality, effectiveness, and fairness persist. His case highlights the complexities of the justice system, particularly in capital cases. It involves intricate legal procedures, scientific evidence, and executive decisions. In his final statement, Smith questioned why anyone would want to see someone killed. He posed a fundamental question about the state's role in taking a life. "You stated, 'We're supposed to be a civilized country.' This implied a belief that state-sponsored killing is incompatible with the values of a civilized society." The debate surrounding his execution touched upon issues of retribution versus rehabilitation. It also involved discussions about the risk of executing innocent individuals. The protocol failures in Tennessee added another layer to the debate. They raised questions about the state's capacity to carry out executions without error or undue suffering. Smith's case is now part of the history of capital punishment in Tennessee. It will be referenced in future discussions about the death penalty. His final words and the concerns raised by his attorney will likely be cited by advocates against capital punishment. They provide powerful testimony against the practice. The execution underscored the finality of the death penalty. Once carried out, there is no possibility of rectifying a wrongful conviction. The case prompted reflection on the long journey from crime to execution. It involved decades of legal battles, scientific advancements, and shifts in public opinion. Ultimately, Oscar Smith's execution was more than just the end of one man's life. It was a moment that encapsulated many of the enduring controversies and criticisms surrounding capital punishment in the United States.